Welcome back. We're coming to you this week from the streets of Los Angeles. It's been a busy week for the media covering this election campaign, and as usual, we've had our eye on the highlights and the lowlights. Here's Richard Gisbert with Election Post.
Media coverage of the U.S. presidential election campaign is no longer limited to mainstream sources. The new media space is crowded with voices who have plenty to say about the race, and part of their job is keeping an eye on what big media are up to.
This stunning situation in Florida.
There was a time when the mainstream media, television, radio, and print, were the exclusive domains for the reporting of politics in America. Those days are gone. There are now a myriad of sites reporting on politics and the 2008 election, and reporting on the people who report on politics.
Media Matters is an explicit watchdog organization that looks for bias in reporting or sexism or any sort of prejudice or bias that might come out in the TV reporting and print reporting, pretty much most mainstream media sources. It does have a very liberal bent, so they've had a lot of business this election talking about the perceived bias for John McCain among the members of the mainstream media.
Crooks and Liars is an interesting site in that it just grabs the video from cable news shows and network news shows and tries to offer a real-time or close to real-time response to it. And again, the value here is that you can look at the transcript, watch the video, and read someone's analysis of this.
TalkingPointsMemo.com is a blog that broke one of the biggest political stories of last year: the Bush administration's firing of uncooperative lawyers from the U.S. Justice Department. TPM.com pushed and pushed the story until the mainstream media finally caught on.
That was a really good example of how, if there's something that isn't getting a lot of coverage in the mainstream media, Talking Points Memo or any other blog can kind of push it up and show that it's really undeniable, and then hope that it gets more coverage in the mainstream press.
We bombed Hiroshima!
I think the conservative blogs have done a good job of pushing the Jeremiah Wright story. That story existed on the right-wing blogs and on the internet for weeks, if not months, before the mainstream media started playing catch-up with it.
By the way, I'm with you, and I hope you'll pray for me, Reverend.
All of these sites offer people a way of looking at the media more critically and more skeptically that simply wasn't available 10 years ago. And I think that's the exciting part about it. Exciting to us, maybe not as exciting to the network newscasts.
The awful, despicable Media Matters outfit.
Some newscasts in particular. Fox News' Bill O'Reilly hosts the most-watched show on 24-hour news. He's a conservative who's at war with Media Matters and some of his other left-wing critics who doggedly document his every journalistic faux pas.
Media Matters, Huffington Post, Daily Kos. I mean, these are fascists.
Media Matters can really get under their skin. And if Media Matters or any other watchdog organization goes after him, then Bill O'Reilly can have a show that night that says, look at these liberals who aren't letting me say my mind, or I can't believe that they would skew it this way.
Well, they're going to brand people racist anyway. That's what Media Matters does.
O'Reilly's misjudgment, I think, in this case, is that he's elevated his critics. And I think a key part of any PR strategy would be don't give your critics any more publicity than they're already getting.
I get so frustrated by Media Matters and others. He's like, how dare you quote me? Well, all we're doing is putting what you said on the web and showing people that it isn't true.
However, just because the people behind watchdog sites are so critical of the mainstream media, particularly television news, that doesn't mean they are above appearing on those channels.
Tonight we invited bloggers from the left and from the right to slug it out.
They're popping up more and more often, amplifying their impact on American politics. However, the bloggers will continue to play their watchdog role. Who else would question the mainstream media for overlooking stories that should be discussed in the election campaign, like the recent battle over Basra or the latest revelations about the U.S. policy on torture?
Instead, the media is covering things like Barack Obama goes bowling and he gets a low score. The media is so desperate for profits, so desperate for ratings. With all this new competition around, they're fighting for their lives, that they're not taking on the complex stories that might be more important but don't have that kind of visceral impact.
And we'll be back here next week on the Election Post with more on the media and the U.S. vote.
We're back in Los Angeles, where we've been looking at the sometimes uneasy relationship between Black and Latino communities. But the Black-Brown divide is a dynamic that's playing out across America, and we want to take you 1,700 miles east now to New Orleans, where African-American and Latino migrant workers are being pitted against each other in search of precious reconstruction jobs rebuilding the city 2.5 years after Katrina. But there are some signs of hope, particularly in grassroots labor groups that are trying to build new alliances and bridge the divide. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, New Orleans was both devastated and divided by the flood and its aftermath.
When the storm passes, the federal government has got assets and resources that we'll be deploying to help you.
The Bush administration was embarrassed by its initial response to the disaster, and tens of billions of dollars in reconstruction contracts flowed into the region. But the money arrived under very specific conditions. Living wage laws were suspended, and restrictions eased on immigrant workers. The stage was set for an influx of Latino migrants to take jobs at low wages.
So I've seen a real influx of the immigrant trades coming to this country working. It's basically the bulk of our labor force.
Many new workers were put up in hotels by their employers, often 4 or 5 to a room, while others camped out in their construction sites. Meanwhile, there was precious little temporary housing for around 200,000 mostly African-American residents displaced by the flood. Much of the city's Black working class was bussed far away from the reconstruction.
Hundreds of thousands of immigrant workers were brought in to the Gulf Coast. And although they were included in the reconstruction, they were exploited. While African-American workers are locked out and systematically excluded,
a lot of Latinos are undocumented, and they're willing to work for less than Black workers who are documented. Black workers will never accept what Latinos are getting paid.
Relying on Hispanic immigrant labor is nothing new in America. But in New Orleans, a city raw with racial tensions after Katrina, the heavy presence of Latino workers in the reconstruction has played right into all the old stereotypes.
What happens with African Americans, they're not used to working as hard as Latinos. It's not important to us if it rains, if it's cold, if it's really hot outside. You'll still see Latino workers on top of a roof or under a building or whatever. Black workers aren't like that.
There's a lot of myths about American workers, such as, African American workers, that we don't want to work anymore. And so this myth permeates throughout the contractors here in New Orleans, and it's hard for African Americans to get jobs.
Nowhere is the Black-Brown divide more visible than outside the Home Depot in the lower 9th Ward. Workers show up as early as 6 a.m. and sit waiting for contractors. It's a place where communities are pitted against each other in real time, day after day.
As a human being, what kicks in is, well, wow, this other nationality is taking work from me, taking food out of my mouth as well as the kids' mouth.
It's been nearly 3 years since Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. Half of the city's working poor, mostly Black, have not returned. The workforce is now almost 30% Latino. Before the storm, Latinos made up only 3% of the population. New Orleans is an extreme case, but it's one symbolic of historic change in the landscape of working-class America.
The 6 months after Hurricane Katrina became the last 25 years of American political history in microcosm. The arrival of new immigrants, the disappearance of African-American jobs, the pitting of workers against each other by companies who were competing for the cheapest worker. In that short span of time, we saw American history replayed and redoubled in front of our eyes.
That's all the time we have for this week's show from Los Angeles, California. Until next time, so long.